Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever felt helpless, all alone and disconnected from the world, then do we have the One World Show for you. Today I'll be talking with Tom Chi, inventor, leader, speaker, and coach, one of the original founders of Google X and the self-proclaimed lab director of the planet. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about the science behind how we are all one in one planet and what shifts we can make to change our lives and the world around us. That plus we'll talk about Laniakea, Hemi-bee, supernovas, ants and humans, robots and kale, the rights of rivers and trees, playing the piano, and what in the world pause has to do with anything. So welcome to the show, Tom. Are you ready to shine?
Yeah, let's do it.
Woohoo! All right, so before we dive into how we're all interconnected, are you really working to plant 20 billion trees?
The goal is to do 20 billion a year for 50 years because you want to do a trillion. So the goal is a trillion actually, but yes.
And what are you doing to achieve that? I've seen drones, I've seen little capsules that you're shooting in the ground 4 centimeters apart. What can you tell me about it?
Yeah, it's not 4 centimeters apart. We can go and plan a map of how to plant, and then we can we can put the seeds in the ground with an accuracy of about 4 centimeters of where they're supposed to be. And the main thing is that if you use drones to go and plant trees, then you can avoid some of the pitfalls. You don't need to you don't need to, and we definitely don't do monocropping. Like we'll go and work with local ecologists and get the advice on which collection of species to go plant. So it's typically several species. And then you don't want to put them just randomly in the environment. You want to put them in the point in the environment where the moisture conditions and sun conditions are going to be appropriate for their growth. So the benefit of using drones to go plant is you can precision plant and put them exactly in the landscape where you would want to put them. And the goal of that organization is called Biocarbon Engineering.
Yeah.
Started in Oxford, UK. And they look at using automation in order to do full ecosystem restoration.
Very, very cool. And we're going to dive into that in the second half of the interview. We're going to dive more into that. I'm teasing people saying we're going to talk about some of these amazing innovations and how we can use them to change the planet. I know after I heard your talk at our day on this, I started looking at the 42 acres that we live on. And I'm saying, how can we turn this into a carbon sink? And was this originally bushland or was it trees? Because what I learned from living on Maui for years is that where there's trees, there's rain. What we think is a dry climate may not necessarily be that at all. It may be that the trees aren't there to attract in the water anymore.
That's correct. So trees transpire, and as they transpire, then they seed clouds, which bring the rain. They also can attract the rain as they transpire. It's basically like water vapor coming up from their leaves. And as that water vapor gets to higher altitudes and condenses, then it creates a low pressure area, which oftentimes brings rain in as well.
Very, very cool. So we'll dive back there in a bit. First, I want to talk about the science of how we are all one. And you have an amazing talk online about this. I'm wondering if you could share just a little bit of the 3 simple stories of the heart, of the breath, and of the mind.
Yeah, so I basically, yes, like the story of the heart is really a proxy for the story of all the physical stuff that we are made out of. And that story traces back to the stars, and because basically the entire universe was hydrogen for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then because of the action of stars, then everything else got created. So the hydrogen fused inside of the stars to go make them shine, and that became helium, lithium, a couple of the really light elements.
Yep.
And then during things like either in supermassive stars or in supernova explosions, then you get the majority of the heavier elements. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but it's a process called stellar nucleosynthesis, and it's basically the way that all the elements in the periodic table got created. So to the extent that you are made out of and you're surrounded by things that are made out of anything beyond hydrogen, then it means that all that stuff was created in stars. And I follow the path of iron because it's so essential to how our hearts work. Like we can't, the heart is meant to go move blood around. The reason that we move blood around is we need to be able to move that oxygen around. The way we're able to move oxygen around is we have iron in our blood, in a molecule called Heme or Heme B, and that basically has got the ability to go carry the oxygen around because of iron, actually. So, and I wanted to go trace the way that we were connected in a fully, it sounds very scientific and detailed, but I wanted to make it really mundane. So things like your heartbeat and your breath and your thoughts are things that we experience literally all the time. And I feel like a lot of the other ways that people have described how we're all connected is very esoteric, where they say, oh, well, in our traditions, the Great Spirit says that everything's, and it's like, okay. And I'm not actually even trying to counter any of those stories. I just want people to have a very direct experience of what I'm talking about, not something that requires, any abstraction or any series of beliefs that you couldn't just immediately experience.
I want to back you up for just a second. I want to talk about Hemi B and where it comes from, and then the galactic collisions.
Oh, yes, that's a very important one. You're right. So, Heme B is basically the part of hemoglobin. So the hemoglobin is in your blood. Heme B is the molecule in hemoglobin that allows you to go carry oxygen, and its oxygen carrying capability is basically facilitated by iron.
Yeah.
And iron is a really special thing on the periodic table because it doesn't just accidentally get created in stars. It needs to be created most often through supernova, very occasionally in supermassive stars, but most often through supernovas. And what happens is that you can't create something like the Earth because the Earth is made out of iron, silicon, actually these pretty heavy things.
Yeah.
You can't create something like the Earth without having a star that has a lot of heavy metals in it. And you can't get to that through just one supernova explosion. It turns out that you need to have a whole series of them, somewhere between, for our sun and planet, we don't know the exact number, but it's probably somewhere between 5 to 20 supernova explosions were between where we are right now and the it's called the metallicity, but it's like the metal composition of and metals refer to really almost everything that's not helium and hydrogen. And these are astrophysics terms. It's not like I know in chemistry, those some of the things that are not hydrogen and helium are not metals, but like astrophysicists oversimplify it and just say everything other than those two are metals.
Yep.
Anyhow, you can only get to that after our composition after a whole series of supernova explosions. And it turns out that once a star explodes, it typically doesn't really want to come back together. All the stuff is all over the place.
Yep.
So the ability for you to go create a whole series of supernova explosions, which is required to get to the level of metal content of our solar system and our life experience, then you need another mechanism to be able to go bring all the scattered, gas and dust from previous explosions back together. And the kind of main mechanism for that is actually the collision of galaxies. Because, I guess that's just the main mechanism. So you've got these galaxies kind of swirling around. When two galaxies collide, then you can imagine there's all this diffuse gas and dust that had been scattered from previous supernova explosions. But when the galaxies collide, then that gas and dust kind of gets a second life. It gets kind of all stirred up and mixed up in the collision process and oftentimes refused back into new stars. So effectively, you can't get the metallicity level that would allow us to be, what we are without exploding stars, colliding galaxies, and then something like Laniakea, which is what you have behind you, is it's basically the gravitational watershed. So we didn't really have a good understanding or a good scientific definition of what a cluster of galaxies was. We used to just have these very vague terms like supercluster, where you just said, well, here's our galaxy, and then there's a bunch of galaxies around it. So we'll just call that cluster of galaxies. And then if we scoot out even further, we have clusters of clusters. We'll just call that a supercluster. So it's very kind of ill-defined. But Brent Tully at the University of Hawaii did this work in 2011, and he worked off of a way more foundational premise, which is the idea of a gravitational watershed. And what that is basically, you can imagine like, a watershed. If you dump a bucket of water out, on the east side of the Rockies, then it'll head toward the Mississippi. Yeah. If you dump it on the other side, it'll head out to the Pacific, right? So that's kind of the watershed divide in our nation. Similarly, there's gravitational watersheds that if you have a galaxy on this side of the line, then it'll kind of swirl and play with this set of galaxies. And when you have it on the other side of the line, it'll swirl and play with a different set of galaxies. And that was for the first time ever in 2011. We defined a very clear scientific definition of what the boundaries of a supercluster should be. And it actually made it much larger than what we had previously been calling our supercluster, to be something like 100,000 galaxies. And every point in the graphic behind you is a galaxy, and the kind of orange lines is the path that those galaxies will take over the span of 1 billion years or so. And that basically shows kind of the swarming and interacting pattern that drives the galaxies to collide with each other, which then drives, the new star formation, which then drives the whole series of stars being born and stars dying that allows us to go have the metallicity level that would allow us our hearts to beat, basically.
Beautiful. And so we are all a part of, in a sense, not to make it sound woo-woo today, but we are all a part of this river of light of these flowing galaxies.
Yes, that's definitely the case. And I think this was important because, there is kind of this sense, and the existentialists talked about this a bunch, where it's like, oh, we are just this little common thing, we are insignificant, a little speck in the universe. But it's kind of like, if it wasn't for all this stuff, then like really things needed to happen at the full level of hundreds of thousands of galaxies swirling into each other for us to exist. And it makes it so that, because there was this kind of idea, it's like, well, Earth is alone. Well, Earth is not alone if you think about the processes that create Earths around the universe. And it means that there is like a very direct line of dynamics and connections from the very, very biggest scales of space and time all the way down to us, and none of them exist without the other.
Beautiful. So let's actually transition from there to the story of the breath. And speaking of one not existing without the other, we would not exist with this tiny little blue-green bacteria.
Yeah, let's call this cyanobacteria, and you have seen a bunch of them because they are also the original source of the green color in plants. Because basically, way back in the day, plants figured out this cool trick that if they were able to go capture a bunch of cyanobacteria, they could lean on them to go produce energy for them through photosynthesis. And cyanobacteria were like these really basic, single-celled organisms way back in the day, though they can also organize as clusters of cells or whatever. But like that figured out the cool trick of being able to take in light and use it to go produce energy for the cell to live. Up until then, things were more chemical energy, or a critter eats another critter, but mostly chemical energy at the point that cyanobacteria was first formed. but being able to use light from the sun in order to go live, it was a super cool trick. And as far as we know in biological history, it basically happened once.
Mhm.
And everything else basically started to be built from that. And it was actually that tiny organism which created the whole, basically redid the entire atmosphere. Because we have more carbon dioxide than we should right now, but back in the day, like the atmosphere was somewhere between 10 to 30% carbon dioxide and almost no oxygen. And through the process of cyanobacteria kind of getting to work over a couple billion years, over 2 billion years, they were able to go change the composition of the atmosphere. So that was almost reversed. We got like 0.4% carbon dioxide and 22% oxygen. So, and because of that, like every single breath that we take was built off of billions of years of work of this one tiny organism. And that's kind of the foundational idea in the story of breath. So the first one was the story of the heartbeat, which was really about the story of all the physical materials that make you up. And then the second one is the story of breath, which is really the story of all of life on Earth. But of course, without life on Earth, you don't have a breath. But also the way that life on Earth continues to be continuously connected. It's not even like, we had so many, incorrect ideas, mostly stemming from the idea that humans were special, actually, which humans are special, but we chose a kind of sensibility of specialness that made us alone in our minds. And all of that's not true, because they're like, well, here we are on this little pinpoint of a planet drifting alone. It's like, no, the actually entire universe cradled the possibility of these types of planets existing. Oh, here we are, we're this one organism out there against nature. And it's like, no, actually, nature is supporting every breath, every bite that you eat, every, like there's tiny microbes in your skin and in your gut that are basically directly helping you live every second. And it's like we both didn't know the science well enough, and we also had a level of hubris that had us fashion a narrative around what it meant to be an individual or a member of the human species that really just made us alone, and very problematic. Anyhow,
Well,
so
no,
the story,
it's fascinating. Before we dive into that, it's fascinating because if we had a different narrative, for instance, if we had the narrative of the ant who collaborates
yes,
together, eats a lot more than us, but has the same biomass as us, as you lay out. If we had a different narrative, we would probably have a very different outcome at this point, because it would be a lot more collaborative versus an us against them and us against nature and us alone in the universe, and we must fight and strive alone to survive.
yes, and like I use the word narrative because that's the way that it connects in people's day-to-day life.
Mhm.
But like, I am a fan of the sort of narratives which also happen to just simply be true. And there's types of narratives where um, it's true because everybody believes it's true.
Mhm.
And then there's types of narratives that even if nobody believed, it would be true. And I prefer the second type of narrative, and this is why, and also my background is, scientist, astrophysicist, so like it's very natural for me to use that lens. But I like that lens because it was true a billion years ago. It's true now. It'll be true in a billion years from now. It doesn't matter your political affiliation, like your cultural background, like the politics that you have. It's the things that I use to go construct the narratives of life are just things that are just true. Because there is a similar amount of biomass of ants on the planet to humans. Ants though eat 10 times more of their body weight per day than we do. So actually it means ants eat 10 times more of the planet than we do every single day. And yet somehow we don't worry about ant overpopulation. And these things are just true right now. So like if you I get a lot more. I guess the way that I kind of like operate in the world is I'll run into narratives from time to time. And first I would say, okay, how's everything going? If everything's going great, then I might not even poke into the narrative and see what's going on.
Yeah.
But when things are not going great, then I ask, well, wait a second, is the narrative true? And around a lot of our sensibility of self and competition and what it takes to go be competitive in the global economy today, or the entire Western philosophy around the individual, I was like, oh, it's not going that well. And probably let's go look at some of these things if they're true. Oh, some of the things are not true. Okay, well, that's good to know. And then you try to get into the process of establishing, well, what are the foundations of truth that you could go recreate the narrative from? And that's really what a lot of my work is about.
Is there another, and I'm going to dump into the story of the mind at the moment, but is there another key narrative that has been on your mind a lot lately?
Yeah, I mean, every one of these things is like a 5 hour conversation, but I've been, thinking a lot about the narrative of capitalism and capital.
Mhm.
And I like the way that some folks are talking about things right now, where we're calling this age late capitalism. And it, just like there's the late Cretaceous period, this is like late capitalism. And you say, okay, yeah, capitalism went through several different generations and instantiations, and it affected the way that we decided to think about our own lives and the entire world.
Mhm.
And we're starting to, in late capitalism, we're starting to become a little bit more awake around things like the narrative of the invisible hand, because we kind of swapped in the invisible hand of capitalism for how we used to think of God, where we kind of like, well, God knows best, so we just leave it up to God. And now we're like, nah, the invisible hand knows best. We'll leave it up to the invisible hand. But this is us really blowing it, because we kind of change capitalism from a tool into a religion. Like, capitalism is, in fact, a really useful tool to make the flow of capital efficient in a specific endeavor. So imagine it's a tool like a hammer.
Mhm.
But just like a hammer, you could use a hammer to go and build houses and create a lot of good in the world. And you can use, hammers to break windows or kill people if you needed to, and do a lot of harm in the world. And you don't want to treat the hammer like a religion. You don't want to pray to the hammer and wait for the invisible guidance of the hammer to do something. That's madness. But like, we've taken the tool that is capitalism and we've treated it that way. It is something, a tool that, if used well in the right situations, can create some real good. It is a tool that, if used poorly in other situations, or when we abdicate our moral responsibility to use the tool wisely, then it can create a lot of harm. And I think in late capitalism, we are recognizing this, and we are going to have a totally new relationship to it. We are going to um, remove it from some areas where it is not the appropriate tool. We're going to use it more wisely in some areas where it is the appropriate tool. And we will stop treating it as a religion. That's madness.
This is a brilliant concept, and it's making me think of the direction I go with, and a lot of people, and with the coaching work I do. The mind, our mind, not consciousness that we're talking about, the greater mind, but the mind is the tool, and the heart or consciousness is actually the driver that uses the tool. And you don't just put the tool out there on its own and say, get the job done. We need something steering, directing.
Hmm. Yes, in the process of becoming skillful in the application of tools, then this is really the work of this time period. I think people have also, we need a different word for this, but people have also, there's a big pushback on patriarchy right now.
Mhm.
And there's maybe a misconception or a limited conception that patriarchy is about, like, oh, it's all the men to blame, that's the problem. It's like, no, what patriarchy is giving up your local agency to something that you believe to be a higher authority.
Mm-hmm.
And, whatever, maybe historically it was a father figure, which comes, and whether that be through your religion or looking up to the head of a corporation or whatever, right? But it doesn't need to be a man in order for it to be patriarchy. But like what is happening there is you are giving up the steering mechanism on the tools of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, you create very imbalanced power structures which concentrate power at the very top of the thing. And we are seeing that both in how money is distributed, we see that in how political power is distributed, we see that and at a level that it's clearly harmful. And this is the reason that I think that people are pushing back. And like I feel like the more limited view is screw patriarchy, all the men need to be out of power. But actually, like patriarchy is in you. Like your, basic, reflex of abdicating your personal, agency and ability to make sense of a situation and speak up and do good on your own behalf is the foundational act of patriarchy. And whoever you have in power, we could have all women in power and still run it like a patriarchy. So this is not to say that we should not have a greater diversity of people that are leaders as well, but I think the more expansive understanding of what we need to overturn in this time period is the reclaiming of that personal agency, the guide, like becoming skillful in the guidance of one's conscious or heart, as you were referring to it, and that is where the end of patriarchy comes from.
Beautiful. And let's dive into that in just a little bit. Let's talk about the story of the mind, how our minds are connected, because I think when we understand this and understand more of this connection, then it actually makes it easier to dive in. There's more self-agency.
Yes, because even though I said a bunch of things about the self right now, then it is very profound and impactful to understand the way in which our thoughts and our self is built together out of the work of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So right now we're speaking in English. I can also speak a little Mandarin and Spanish, but whatever language we're talking, like I did not come up with these words, right? So somebody in the past, really a large collection of people in the past, came up with every single word that we're saying, its definition, how to say it, its proper usage, its common usage, all these sorts of things. And what is true of words, which are pretty obvious, we did not come up with the words, is true of even more sophisticated thought patterns as well. And in my talk, I talk about, 500 years ago, it was impossible to be a concert pianist because the piano wasn't even invented yet. And it means that there's kind of like patterns of mind. Because if you were to like put, concert pianists today into functional MRI scanners as they're playing the piano, you would see patterns of mind that are truly unique to playing that instrument. And what we do in the process of creating, ways of being, and what we do in the process of inventing things like a piano or a computer or, whatever, what have you in your life, is we enable particular patterns of mind. And I call this the palette of being. Mm-hmm. Basically, that there is a very large, collection, a whole kind of palette of numerous colors of ways that people can be. And you can apply this to any sort of space, but like, the way that our minds are constructed is we end up kind of getting inspired by the colors from this person's palette and the colors from this person's palette and the colors from this person's palette. And then our lives are basically the ability is like the unique paintings that we create, which also in the process makes up new colors that people can look at. So I know, for example, that some folks that are in my palette is I was inspired by the work of Buckminster Fuller,
Hmm.
Prince, the musician, Khalil Gibran, like these sorts of folks. I like look at a lot of the things that they did in their life, and it's like, oh, I want to be able to go draw from that. I want to go use some of those colors. And I know that in my life, like part of the reason that I think I'm a scientist for sure, but I also try to think poetically, and I also think like to think about how can you say some of the things that are that are not easy to say, but say them in a way that draws people in. Like somebody like Prince actually said a lot of things which were very groundbreaking, but he said it in a way that his style was more sensual and seductive, but mine is a little bit more like a little more friendly. But it's a similar kind of idea, which is like, let's go say a bunch of things that would normally, you know, um, be taboo to say. Like I don't know. We just talked about taking down patriarchy, capitalism.
We did.
Like changing the basic definition of the individual. But I like want to advance those things in a way where they. It's probably too much to say that they have their own seduction, but at least they are approachable in a way that a lot of people can kind of get into it. And um, you know, I guess Prince made them dance and like move into joy. For me, like it's more of like move into this greater sense of connectedness and compassion and care for each other.
Well, yes, you did it. If we look at the energy, and yes, I've got this Laniakea behind me, and it's strings of energy is what I'm seeing. If we
Hmm.
follow the energy strings from which you're speaking, they're very. If we want to go patriarchal, non-patriarchal, if we talk about more of yin and yang, there's more of a yin, a gentleness to it. It doesn't have to be this explosive overthrow of a patriarchy, overthrow of a capitalism. Let's learn from this. Let's explore this. Let's dive in and see what new thing that we can create together, how we can tweak or change the narrative. By the different ways of saying things, we create a different way of being.
That's exactly right. And my style definitely is way more about the invitation, which is like, here are other ways of thinking about it. And there might be some great things that happen if you think about it that way. And you kind of invite folks in. I do also have a little bit of the streak of the revolutionary, but like most of my talks are invitational.
Mhm.
Like the revolutionary streak is the thing that would make you decide to even start talking about these things.
So, give us an example of that.
Well, I don't have that much of an attachment to the way that society is built right now.
Mm.
And this is almost like the accidental revolutionary, because sometimes like you're so put down by society, you're like, no, I need to tear it all down. And I'll have those thoughts from time to time, but mostly but when things are just terrible. And not even necessarily just terrible for me. I remember when I was like 10 or 11 years old, there was this savings and loan scandal in Wall Street. This is
Oh,
in
yeah.
the late 80s. And I remember, and I was just a kid. I was like learning how to read. I would try to read the paper. And I remember reading in the Washington Post about like, you know, stockbrokers and Wall Street traders that were committing suicide, jumping off of buildings because their net worth had gone down from 100 million to 30 million. And I was like, oh my God, how insane is this? Like, you went from being crazy rich to still being pretty rich, and like somehow the change of a number in an account somewhere
Mm.
made you decide that life was not worth living. And like I remember reading that, I was probably 12. And I remember reading that and thinking we should tear this all down. So that's a little bit of the streak of the revolutionary. I guess I also could have felt like, well, I mean, I think the tear it all down also came from that sense of compassion of like, what would make a human being do this?
Mhm.
Actually, what would make a whole system of human beings do this to each other? that, that the best choice would be to jump off of a building, you know, because the number changed. And yeah, I remember, whatever, you're 12, things impact you a lot. I guess things still impact me, but like I looked at that, and like that kind of feeling of this is just totally broken. And because of it, I go into society not with the assumption like, oh, things are going to basically keep being like this.
Mhm.
I go into the assumption of we made this whole thing and we can make it another way. So just my level of attachment to exactly how it's constructed right now is very low. So it creates almost kind of like a little, auto revolutionary, engine in my thought process, where whenever anything's like obviously messed up, then you're like, no, we should just tear it all down. Like, there's no reason we can't make it a different thing.
And you are quite empowered, and that's what I'm doing with the show here. Is for some reason we don't have the gene in us that says, no, it is as it is, just leave it alone, just accept and move along. Instead, we're looking at it and going, all right, let's tear this mother down. What do we want to put in its place, and how do we do that? In fact, there's a couple key things I want to go into, and let's talk about how we empower people. This, you talk about, with each breath, we are becoming more of the earth. How interconnected are, if we talk about, I'll throw out a couple terms. 150, is it kilometers per hour, and 4 to 5 days?
Oh yeah. So I chose the breath because air moves around the planet real fast. And we are constantly exchanging out our body mass with the air. So at the upper levels of the atmosphere, people are familiar with the jet stream. Up at the level of the jet stream, then air kind of gets to the other side of the world in about 4 to 5 days. So breath out that you do right now, that air, if you were to, could visualize these molecules, they're bouncing around, they're everywhere in your house in a very, in whatever, the span of 10 seconds. They're poking around, they're bouncing out, they're getting into the atmosphere in the span of a minute. And then once they're in the atmosphere, yeah, a chunk of them get up into the upper atmosphere. If you think about how many billions of billions of billions of atoms that we breathe in the course of a day. So they're all bouncing all over the place. And as they get to the other upper atmosphere, they will get to the other side of the planet in 4 days. And it means that everything that is living is basically becoming each other constantly in that kind of span. It doesn't even matter where on Earth it is. So a plant producing some oxygen right now, in some super remote island, the Falkland Islands in the South Pacific or whatever, I'm breathing that in a couple days. And us breathing out, those plants are breathing that in a couple days. And other people are interacting that within a couple days. And of course, the people that are physically closer to you, it's probably within the day, sometimes within the minute or hour. But like, and it's not a small amount of us. If you were to add up, the amount of mass that we breathe in and breathe out, drink in liquid form, leaves our body in liquid form, sweat, evaporation, urination, stuff that we eat in solid that goes through our digestive system. It turns out to be about 7% of our mass every single day, and that is equivalent to the weight of your arm. Like if you were to take one of your arms, that's how much mass is changing out in you every day. And you think about like, oh, well, it doesn't even take that long before the equivalent weight of my entire body exchanges out. So it's about 2 weeks before the entire weight of your body changes out through respiration, through water. So we are, constantly becoming the environment, and the environment is becoming us. Thich Nhat Hanh, refers to this in English as inner being. In Buddhism, it's got a different phrase, but it doesn't matter. It's the general gist of it is very precisely right, which is there is our individual sense of being, but the actual reality of being is constant inner being. That like we are becoming everything and everything is becoming us all the time. Not even like, oh, you're born and then you die and you return to some larger piece of the universe. It's true then too, but it's also true every second of your life.
And so if we understand this, that we're constantly in a state of inner becoming and we're constantly in a state of inner and outer exchange, if we can wrap our minds around this, then I have this image in my head of a rowboat, and one end of the boat is sinking, and there are people at the bottom of the boat, and they're scooping out water, and the people at the other end of the boat that are in the air are going, "Thank God it's their side, not ours."
Mm-hmm.
If we can wrap our minds around it, it changes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah. So many of the little games that we play would become obviously dumb. So like in the US, especially right now, there's all this narrative around it's like, oh, China's cheating us, China's the enemy. If you go to China, they don't think of the US as the enemy. They're like, they're our biggest economic trading partner. Like, what in the world is that? They think of us the way that, we think of Canada. It's like a big, peaceful trading partner. And it's like, why in the world did we come up with that narrative then? Oh, it's because we had seen in the past America has risen to excellence when it was fighting against the Russians, or the Soviet Union, in order to go and win the space race. And then we were fighting against the Japanese for our modernization of our production lines. So, like the American narrative likes the idea of opposition and conquering. And I don't know. I'm not against like playing a fun game from time to time, but we should also recognize that that's just a narrative that we made up. That actually, at least in the case of the USSR and the US, they also thought we were their competition. But like in this case, it feels dumb actually. Like they're not even playing that game.
And it can create dangerous consequences, either in international relations. And I was just with the Nobel Peace Laureates last week in Mexico. It can create dangerous situations, or it can create big internal challenges where you've got a mess internally because you think there's this big bad enemy out there. And so your entire lives, instead of revolving around how can we heal, how can we do the inner work, how can we feed the planet, how can we work to heal the planet, is instead back in old conquest, protection, fortify mode.
Yeah, I mean, we could also ask the question, how in the world did China become so economically developed in so few decades?
Mm-hmm.
And you'll find out that they invest a lot in education. A crazy thing, and I'm from Taiwan, which has not had the greatest relationship with China, so this is definitely not just bolstering China because I think that they're the best. No,
And I'll go full disclosure. I have a American-born Chinese wife whose parents had escaped from China with the whole revolution and moved to Taiwan before moving to the U.S.
Yeah, so China's not perfect in any regard, but if we stopped thinking about them as a rival for a moment and said, how in the world did you do so much economic development in so little time? You would see how much they invested in education. You would find out interesting things like that, they got so passionate about teaching English. There's more English speakers in China than there are in the US now. And I was like, holy crap, like y'all are really making big changes.
Yeah.
Now, it's not that like we need to do it exactly the way that they did. But like, if we had more of a mindset of like, well, we really do want to grow our economy. We really do want to make our folks prosperous. We really do want to, create a successful sense of life and a reality of life for as many people as we can in this country. We would be looking around and being like, man, how did these folks put together their healthcare system? How did these people get their energy sector so good in such a short amount of time? Okay, China, how did you guys economically develop so quickly? And that would be less of a sense of like, these people are cheating, we need to defeat them. It'd be more of a buffet of like different, things on the palette of being, but up at the society level and not, at the individual level.
Beautiful. So let's switch gears from there. I'm going to bring us full circle, and I want to talk about because you and I met at our day, the American Renewable Energy Day Symposium out here in Colorado, and we were all looking at ways of changing the narrative to change the planet in a sense, go back to a more sustainable way of being. And so I'm wondering if you can share a few invention catalysts with us and what that means and what we can do ourselves to change our own narrative to go from a place of helplessness and hopelessness to wait, there is something I can do.
Yeah, I mean, first off, like understand the narrative of helpless and hopelessness is exactly what, people would like to, folks in power like to go advance some sort of sense that you're helpless or hopeless, right? Especially if they are also bought into the sensibility of patriarchy,
Mhm.
where they say, oh, well, you guys couldn't do this without me anyway. You guys are insignificant nothings. Oh, your lives are, just for the greater good of the state. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that's so the helplessness and hopelessness, or even like the kind of quote unquote debate around climate. I was like, oh, this is really just a way of seeding, more helplessness and hopelessness.
Yes.
And so, like, go down to the basics of the effect. Like, if there's a thought process that you are living in your life where you're like, oh, this makes me feel ready to go engage, be informed, take real action in life, like, uh, you know, um, do what I can for myself, my family, my community, then stick with that. That's great. But if you are, engaging in a set of conversations or living in a narrative where the opposite of that is true, then you need kind of a big shakeup. And a lot of the stuff that I teach are different ways of challenging the existing narratives, whether it be a bunch of, the kind of structural societal narratives that we've mostly been talking about.
Mhm.
And I also have a bunch of work around like personal, psychological narratives. But anyway, um, you know, connecting with the other thing is that like in my life, I am in this, I try to take this interesting middle position because I feel like there are folks that are in despair, and that's certainly not that productive. And then there's folks that are technological optimists where they'll say like, well, the singularity is coming and we're going to have this artificial intelligence that's smarter than us, and that artificial intelligence will solve climate change. And I was like, no, I mean, I think that's maybe a little bit too optimistic.
Mhm.
And not to say that we should not be imaginative and trying to create things, and that's all great. But it's like, I think it's overly simplistic just to be like, well, we'll just invent some AI and that will solve all the problems. It's like very unlikely. So I like try to take this middle territory of let's try to keep our eyes pretty open to the reality of what's happening. And regardless of the reality of what's happening, let's always take the position of, well, given what's happening, what can we do now? How can we continue to be, resourceful, creative, engaged, in the face of difficulty here, in the face of prosperity here, in the face of all the different conditions that you can be in. So at this particular moment, the thing that I work on, and it's what I was working on my career before this, but but in more of the sector,
Yeah.
is the idea of invention catalysts. And what that idea is basically inventions that like lead to the redoing of entire systems, right? So when we moved from landline phones to cell phones,
Mhm.
it wasn't just a little bit of a change. It wasn't like a 20% better phone. It was a thing that allowed us to redo all of our systems. And similarly, as we move from, regular cars to self-driving cars, then that will allow us to completely rethink how we do cities. It'll allow us to have way fewer cars because you don't need cars to be sitting in your garage idle. Like self-driving cars can be out there doing useful things most of the day, which means that you need way fewer cars to get the same level of transportation utility for people. Um,
I imagine you could even optimize flow as well.
Oh yeah, like we calculated that it wouldn't take more than a couple percentage of self-driving cars on the road in order to make it so that you never end up having an unnecessary traffic jam. Because there are the traffic jams that happen from an actual accident. And it's like, yes, that will go block some lanes of traffic. But then if you've ever been driving on the other side of the road, when there's an accident that's happened you'll have a traffic jam of people rubbernecking. And it's like, oh no, it's called a compression wave traffic jam. Like you can, with even just a couple percentage of self-driving cars on the road, you could eliminate all compression wave traffic jams, which is like more than half of them. Anyhow, so yes, you could redesign all the systems in the face of a handful of good invention catalysts. So my background as a scientist, as an engineer, as a designer, I'm using that toward creating invention catalysts for our relationship to the environment. And this includes building fleets of robots that help to restore ecosystems, to grow food in healthier, more stable ways, resilient ways, like just a whole collection. I mean, this is my work right now, is to both find support through mentorship and funding, and also to directly invent invention catalysts to allow us to have a different potential path forward, a way that we could approach systems entirely differently. And one of the main reframes around the relationship to the environment has been that up until now it was kind of like industry and capitalism is running over here and we just can't help it. It's going to eat up a bunch of natural resources and spit out trash. And then over here we have a bunch of folks working for environmental protection, and we're going to try to put some fences up and protect this area. Oh, let's make a marine protected area. Let's put up this fence and try to save this area of rainforest. Let's set up a national park and put some park rangers on it. And it's not that this had no efficacy at all, but it's just that year over year, decade over decade, it's we're losing the game. We're losing the bigger game. And if you could create a set of invention catalysts that, instead of saying like, hey, let's put a little fence around this area and try not to destroy it, but we could go develop technologies which actively help us, restore and create healthy ecosystems, then we can say, no, actually, we're going to go to work on this, 50,000 acres of degraded land and make it something amazing. Let's go have it so that we have more trees every single year as opposed to cutting them down. Since the beginning of agriculture, humanity has cut down 2.5 trillion trees, somewhere between 2.5 to 3 trillion trees. So like, why don't we invent some invention catalysts that are able to put 1 trillion of them back? And that's kind of the thought process here.
Beautiful. Few last questions here before we let people go. Is there one tool you can give people today to change their personal psychological narrative?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of them. Like, I really like the word nuanced because it allows our minds to become more, really more beautiful, but it also makes them work better.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the things that we get stuck on in life are things where we've created a false binary or we've created a very limited narrative. So we might say, oh, well, this person wants this and I want that and we can't agree. So like we're just stuck. And people will have that kind of narrative. And I'm obviously, simplifying, taking all the details out of it, but leaving the skeleton of the narrative that people have around a lot of things. And you say, well, cool. We could stay there where there's just choice A and choice B and there is no middle ground. Or we can ask the question, how is it nuanced? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of ways to ask how it's nuanced. You might say, well, what would be a blending of A and B? What would be choice C that's neither A nor B? What happens to choice A over time if we keep on sticking with that? What happens to choice B over time if we keep sticking with that? What are the nuances that made me decide on choice A in the first place and then to decide on choice B in the first place? And I'm not going to answer the questions. This is obviously too abstracted at this moment to answer any specific questions, but always when you ask the question, how is it nuanced, then more possibility is created. Where you say, well, they got to choice B because this sort of thing happened in their life. And, after they got robbed that one time, they started to really believe that everybody should be carrying guns. You say, okay, I got it. Cool. Well, that's a really interesting nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And like, it makes you more resourceful because instead of being like, well, can't you see that kids are being gunned down in school? Like, you're a monster for wanting to have firearms. You can bring some compassion to that and be like, yeah, I could imagine, that time that you were mugged, that it was really frightening.
Mm-hmm.
And like, even when you talk to your family's members about it, that's why they are so passionate about, having firearms. No, I got that. And like, how do I engage in this conversation in a more resourceful way, given that nuance? So just being able to ask the question whenever you're stuck, if everything's going fine, don't even bother asking it. It's fine. But like in the places in your life, so let's say 80% of your life is the way you'd want it to be, and 20% you're kind of stuck, then you should ask yourself, well, how is it nuanced? Like, what? Just take any piece of it that you know for sure,
Mm-hmm.
and ask, what else could I learn about it, or how is it nuanced, and that will unstick you.
Thank you. And it's obvious that it's a training. It's something that we practice and start doing more and more. Is there time that you deliberately take to step away from things, to let these ideas come to you, or to have the opportunity? Because particularly in the West, particularly in the US, where we don't even take our vacations, we feel like we're so chasing our tails that we don't have time to ask, how is this nuanced? Or
Hmm.
am I stuck in a paradigm and how do I get out of it?
Well, I mean, one observation is, um, if you don't do it, you get stuck on things for years. So like if your whole point is, oh, I'm rushing around because I need to be more efficient, it's like, well, to be stuck on the same issue for years is super not efficient. So just saying. But like, outside of that, it
Yeah.
also creates, anxiety, stress, depression, all these sorts of things, coping behaviors
Mm-hmm.
that also are super not aligned with you, probably living the way that you want to live. So there is first the observation that the narrative of just doing more faster in order to live a better life in the absence of reflection, the idea of hustle, um, as the mantra for life, it's not complete. I'm not saying that there isn't places where, working a little harder isn't going to help
Mm-hmm.
you make more progress for sure. But it's incomplete because if that's all you do, then you're also very likely to get stuck on things. And I run into entrepreneurs all the time. I work with entrepreneurs all the time. And it's like, oh, I've been hustling. And I can see they've been working 12 hours a day, but they like literally banging their heads in the same way on the same problem for the last 6 months. It's like, okay, well, those are the times where, you should just take the time out and notice. It's like the main problems I have are still the same problems.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I gotta like go and create some nuance here, create a new field of possibilities. So I have a practice where I write in a journal most days, and it can be really simple. I just like write out like a word that describes the task that we have to do today, or something I've been thinking about recently, or thing that has been bugging me for the last couple of weeks. And then you just kind of like free flow it. You just expand out on it, and when the words appear on the page in front of you, they're not swirling in your head anymore. Because like swirling in your head is one of the least effective ways to go deal with it, because it's kind of like it takes some energy to hold up this thought process. It takes some energy to hold up that process. And once you hold all 5 processes up, you don't have any energy left to think about it differently.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go and just write down your thought processes and they're just in front of you on a page, then your head is clear. You don't need to hold up those, thought processes just, by thinking about them. You can just look at them in front of you and be like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Or you can be like I've been drawing the same diagram or writing these same words about the same thing the same way for the last 3 weeks. Like, just look through your own journal about it. And it's like, that's probably a place that could benefit from some nuances. Like, because I'm not making any progress and it looks the same. So these are the sort of things. Obviously, you can recommend meditation and that sort of thing. I typically, tell people to start with guided meditations because it's a little easier to start.
Mm-hmm.
And also, don't try to make meditation into some new moralistic thing where it's like, I'm the best, I'm the most enlightened because I meditate the most. That's dumb. Like, I think, and also meditation is not one thing. Meditation, I think of meditation like the word food. Mm-hmm. Just like there's many flavors of food and they nourish your body in different ways, then there's different, flavors of meditation, and they nourish your mind in different ways and your spirit in different ways. There's like loving kindness meditation, which helps you, develop your compassion for people that are close to you and people that are strangers or even people that you dislike. There is mindfulness meditation, which allows you to have a different relationship between you and the thoughts in your head. There is, body scan meditation, which allows you to recenter in the body and understand, that you are a living being that, on this planet existing in a particular way, and that, your body is the thing that, whatever, you get it. So I would say, if you do get into the meditation train, then don't fall into the pitfall of believing there is a best way to do it, or that there is a perfect form of meditation, or it's some new perfectionist ladder to go climb. Think about it like, oh, this is the food I need right now. And whenever you have an experience in meditation, ask yourself, in what way is this nourishing me? Because they're all different.
Woohoo!
That's a lot of ground. Sorry about that.
No, that's excellent. And it set the stage for maybe having you back in the future, because I can see where we could go, that we could make a profound difference in people's lives. Where can people go, Tom, to find out more today? Is there a website that you want to send people to?
Yeah, you can go to tomchi.com, tomchi.com, and there's a bunch of talks on there. And if you also search my name on YouTube, then there's a bunch of talks, because I spoke at a bunch of conferences and people posted the talks. I don't really have a YouTube channel myself, just other people post my work.
Very, very cool. Any last words of wisdom? This has been a lot of fun today, Tom. Any last words of wisdom? Your eyes are bugging out. You may have covered a lot. You have covered a lot of ground that you want to share with people.
Oh, no, I mean, they're bugging out because it's like, there's just so much more. I mean, so I don't know if
something to empower people so that they feel they can make a difference, whether it's in their own lives, for the planet, for anything.
One thought that I've shared with folks recently, especially as people have been really terrified around the future of the planet, is that, the rarest thing in the world right now is people that are talented and capable and, have a real kind of concern and about where the planet is right now. And do not waste that super rare resource on despair.
That's huge. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And thank you for challenging all of us to look at the world in a different way and look at our own lives in a different way, because there are solutions. I would say it's certainly a middle road, but I see I see a kitty. Pause.
Yeah.
I see possibilities. How's that?
Yes. Okay.
So thank you so much for being here today. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, begin challenging your own narratives and creating new possibilities today, and shine bright. Woohoo! I just had the most incredible interview with Tom Chi on challenging your narratives and changing your life. To check out more incredible videos on living your greatest life, click here, subscribe below.